September 7, 1943. The transport truck lurched to a stop on a dirt road that seemed to lead nowhere, kicking up clouds of rust-colored dust that settled on everything like a fine coating of disappointment. Through the canvas opening at the back, 23 Italian women caught their first glimpse of what would be their home for an undetermined future. It wasn't what any of them had expected. The landscape stretched endlessly in every direction, flat and unforgiving under a sun that felt closer here than it ever had in North Africa. Scrub brush dotted the horizon, and in the distance, wooden structures shimmered in the heat like mirages. This was Texas, they had been told during the long journey from the East Coast Processing Center. But it looked nothing like the America they had imagined from films and propaganda posters. 27-year-old Giulia Rossini was the first to step down from the truck, her legs unsteady after 3 days of travel. She had been a veterinary nurse, attached to an Italian medical unit in Tunisia, when British forces overran their position in May. 5 months of captivity had taught her to expect certain things from her captors: military efficiency, formal coldness, the rigid structure of army life. What she saw now confused every one of those expectations. 3 men stood near the largest building, but they weren't wearing uniforms. Instead, they wore dusty denim, leather vests, and wide-brimmed hats that shadowed their faces. Their postures were relaxed in a way that seemed almost careless, yet Giulia noticed how their eyes tracked every movement with sharp attention. These were not soldiers. The realization sent an unexpected flutter of uncertainty through her chest. Behind her, the other women descended from the truck in silence. Unlike the male POW camps they had passed through, where thousands of prisoners were processed like inventory, this facility was small and isolated. The main compound consisted of only 4 buildings arranged around a central yard. Beyond the fence, she could see horses in a corral and what appeared to be cattle grazing in the distance. This wasn't a military installation, it was a working ranch that had been converted into something else entirely. An American officer approached, his uniform crisp, despite the heat. Captain William Morrison introduced himself with practiced formality, but Giulia barely heard his words. Her attention kept drifting back to the 3 men in civilian clothes who watched from a distance with expressions she couldn't read. They stood with a stillness that seemed bred into them, as natural as breathing. One of them, tall and broad-shouldered with sun-darkened skin, tilted his hat back slightly. For a brief moment, his eyes met hers across the dusty yard. Then he turned and walked toward the stables with a measured gait that spoke of absolute certainty in his place in this unforgiving landscape. Captain Morrison assigned them to a converted bunkhouse that still smelled of hay and leather. As the women claimed their cots and unpacked their meager belongings, the reality of their situation began to settle over them like the dust that coated everything in this strange place. Giulia surveyed her fellow prisoners with the clinical eye she had developed during her medical training. They were a diverse group, ranging in age from 19 to 38, though captivity had aged them all beyond their years. Most had served in administrative or support roles across North Africa, swept up in the chaotic Allied advance that had shattered Italian forces in Tunisia. Maria Campana, a radio operator from Milan, sat on the cot next to Giulia's, carefully folding a tattered photograph of her family. She had been 22 when she volunteered for overseas service, believing Mussolini's promises that Italy would reclaim its ancient glory. Now 23, she rarely spoke of those beliefs anymore. The surrender in May had broken something in her that captivity couldn't quite finish breaking. Across the room, sisters Francesca and Elena Benedetti arranged their shared space with the efficiency of people who had lived in close quarters for too long. Both had worked as clerks in a supply depot in Tripoli. Francesca, the elder at 31, had joined the Fascist Women's Auxiliary in 1937, full of patriotic fervor. Elena had followed 2 years later, simply because her sister had. Now they existed in a strange limbo, neither quite enemies nor quite free. The youngest among them was Lucia Ferraro, barely 19, whose wide, dark eyes still held traces of the girl she had been before the war consumed her adolescence. She had served as a typist at a headquarters unit, far from any fighting. Yet she had seen enough during the retreat to understand that nothing would ever be simple again. They had all been daughters of Mussolini's Italy, in their own ways. Some had believed fervently in the cause. Others had simply followed where family or circumstance led them. A few had joined for practical reasons, seeking education or opportunity in a society that offered women limited choices. But belief or necessity hardly mattered now. They were prisoners in a foreign land, wearing remnants of uniforms that represented a country currently tearing itself apart in civil war. That evening, as the Texas sun finally released its grip on the day, the women gathered near the windows to watch the ranch hands finish their work. The men moved among the horses and cattle with practiced ease, their voices carrying across the yard in a language the prisoners didn't yet understand. There was something in the way these Americans carried themselves, something that made Julia uneasy in a way she couldn't quite name. They moved like men who had never questioned their right to exist in this harsh landscape, who had never needed permission to take up space in the world. The first week passed in a fog of adjustment and observation. The Italian women were assigned light duties around the compound, cleaning, kitchen work, mending equipment under supervision. But their real education came from watching the ranch hands who shared this isolated piece of Texas with them. There were 5 cowboys who worked the ranch full-time, and they inhabited the landscape with a casual ownership that fascinated and unsettled the prisoners in equal measure. Unlike the soldiers the women had known, these men didn't march or salute or speak in clipped military phrases. They communicated in drawls and nods, long silences punctuated by brief observations about weather or livestock or the condition of fencing in the north pasture. The tall man Julia had noticed on their first day was called Jake Sullivan. She learned his name by listening to the other ranch hands, not from any direct introduction. He was the foreman, responsible for the day-to-day operations of the cattle and horses. He stood well over 6 feet, with shoulders broadened by years of physical labor and a face weathered to leather by the relentless Sunday. When he walked, it was with a rolling gait that spoke of countless hours in the saddle. When he worked, his movements were economical and sure, wasting neither energy nor motion. Julia found herself watching him more than she intended. There was something in his quiet competence that demanded attention. She had known officers who commanded through volume and force of personality, soldiers who projected authority through rigid military bearing. Jake Sullivan did neither of these things, yet when he spoke, even in his low, unhurried voice, the other men listened immediately. The other cowboys were cut from similar cloth. Tommy Reeves, younger and quicker to smile, had a gift with horses that bordered on uncanny. Miguel Santos spoke Spanish and broken English, bridging worlds with patient gestures when words failed. Old Henry Pierce, whose weathered face suggested he had seen more years than he cared to count, moved with the careful deliberation of someone who understood his own limitations and worked within them without complaint. What struck Julia most was their silence. Not the silence of men who had nothing to say, but the silence of men who saw no need to fill empty air with unnecessary words. They worked together with an unspoken coordination that suggested years of shared labor. A glance was enough to communicate intention. A slight nod could convey agreement or warning. They seemed to carry an entire vocabulary in their postures and gestures, a language more efficient than speech. The Italian women, accustomed to the constant chatter of military camps and the nervous energy of soldiers preparing for or recovering from combat, didn't know what to make of this quiet masculinity. These men seemed utterly unhurried, yet accomplished more in a day than twice their number of soldiers might manage. They projected strength without aggression, authority without arrogance. It was disorienting in a way that left Julia lying awake at night, trying to understand what she was witnessing. The shift in Julia's captivity came unexpectedly on a cool morning in late September when one of the ranch horses injured itself on barbed wire near the eastern fence line. She was hanging laundry in the compound yard when she heard the commotion, the sharp whinny of pain that triggered something instinctive in her. Before she could think better of it, she was moving toward the corral. Tommy Reeves had the mare cornered, speaking softly while trying to examine the gash along her foreleg. The horse, frightened and hurting, kept pulling away, eyes rolling white with panic. Blood darkened her coat, dripping into the dust. Julia stopped at the fence, her hands gripping the rough wood as she watched Tommy's unsuccessful attempts to calm the animal. Jake Sullivan appeared from the barn carrying medical supplies, his expression concerned but calm. He handed the kit to Tommy and was preparing to rope the mare's head for restraint when Julia heard herself speaking. In her limited English, practiced during the long weeks of captivity but rarely used for anything meaningful, she said, "I can help. I know animals." Both men turned to look at her. For a long moment, Jake studied her face with those steady gray eyes that seemed to see more than they should. Then he did something that surprised her. He nodded once and opened the corral gate. "Come on then," he said simply. Julia approached the frightened mare slowly, her movements instinctive after years of veterinary training. She began speaking in Italian, her voice low and rhythmic, the words themselves meaningless, but the tone everything. The mare's ears flickered toward her. Julia kept up the steady stream of soft Italian, moving closer with each sentence, her hands visible and empty. She had learned this approach from her father, who had kept horses on their small farm outside Rome. "Fear responds to calm," he had told her. "Animals know when you mean them no harm." When she finally touched the mare's neck, she felt the trembling beneath the hide, the rapid heartbeat that spoke of pure panic. She continued her soft murmuring while her hands moved with practiced efficiency, examining the wound with gentle pressure. It was deep but clean, would need stitching but would heal well with proper care. She looked up at Jake and used hand gestures combined with her broken English to communicate what she saw. He understood immediately and handed her the medical kit. For the next 20 minutes, Julia worked while the two cowboys watched in silence. She cleaned the wound, applied antiseptic, and stitched the torn flesh with steady hands, all while maintaining that constant stream of Italian words that kept the mare relatively calm. When she finished, the horse was still standing quietly, her trust won through patience rather than force. Jake Sullivan looked at her with something new in his expression. Respect, perhaps, recognition. "You've done this before?" he said. It wasn't a question. "In Italy," Julia answered. "My father's farm. Then in the war." After the incident with the injured mare, Julia found herself assigned to work with the livestock regularly. Captain Morrison, recognizing a practical use for her skills, approved the arrangement over the objections of some of his subordinates who felt prisoners should be kept to menial tasks. But Morrison was a pragmatic man, and a veterinary nurse was too valuable a resource to waste on laundry duty. The work brought Julia into daily contact with the ranch hands, particularly Jake Sullivan, who oversaw all aspects of animal care on the property. It was in these quiet hours, working alongside men who measured their worth in tangible results rather than ideology or rank, that Julia began to understand how thoroughly Rome had lied to her. She had been taught that Americans were soft, made weak by their comfort and material excess, that they lacked the discipline and spiritual strength of Italians forged under fascism's clarifying fire, that American men especially were corrupted by their democracy, unable to make hard decisions or commit to sacrifice for a greater cause. Every piece of propaganda she had absorbed, every speech she had heard, every article she had read, had reinforced these beliefs until they became simply the way she understood the world. Working beside Jake Sullivan shattered those certainties like glass. There was nothing soft about a man who could work from dawn until dusk under the punishing Texas sun without complaint. Nothing weak about someone who could deliver a breech-birth calf with his bare hands, then clean up and sit down to dinner as if he hadn't just saved 2 lives through sheer determination and skill. Nothing undisciplined about the way he managed the ranch, tracking dozens of variables in his head, making decisions that affected the survival of hundreds of animals and the livelihoods of everyone who depended on this land. The other women were experiencing their own reckonings. Maria, assigned to help in the ranch kitchen, worked alongside the cook's wife, Martha Chen, a second-generation Chinese-American who ran her domain with quiet efficiency. Everything Maria had been told about racial hierarchies and the chaos of American society collided with the reality of this competent woman who commanded respect through her abilities rather than her background. The Benedetti sisters, working on fence repair under Miguel Santos's supervision, discovered that the quiet Mexican-American cowboy possessed an encyclopedic knowledge of the land, could predict weather patterns with uncanny accuracy, and moved between Spanish, English, and the silent language of ranch work with fluid ease. Their Roman education had taught them to see such men as inferior. Reality was proving far more complicated. Even young Lucia, sorting supplies in the equipment barn, found her assumptions crumbling. Old Henry Pierce, who worked alongside her, spoke rarely, but when he did, his observations carried the weight of lived experience. He had fought in the Great War, had seen Europe, had formed opinions about the world based on what he had witnessed rather than what he had been told to believe. His quiet wisdom made the bombastic certainties of Mussolini's speeches seem hollow and childish by comparison. October brought cooler evenings and a particular kind of loneliness that settled over the compound like morning frost. The Italian women were permitted to write letters home through the International Red Cross, though everyone understood that mail moved slowly in wartime, and Italy's current chaos made delivery uncertain at best. Still, they wrote because not writing felt like surrendering the last connection to who they had been before captivity redefined them. Julia sat on her cot with paper and pencil, trying to find words that could bridge the impossible distance between this Texas ranch and her family's farm outside Rome. How could she explain to her father that she was caring for cattle and horses on land that stretched farther than he could imagine, that her captors treated her with more respect than some of her own officers had? That she was beginning to question everything he had raised her to believe about duty, country, and the natural order of the world? In the end, she wrote simple things. She was healthy, she was safe. She was working with animals again, which brought her comfort. She asked about her younger brother, about the farm, about whether the olive trees had produced well this season. She did not mention that Italy had surrendered, that Mussolini had been rescued by Germans and installed as a puppet in the north, that their country was now split between competing governments while foreign armies fought across its length. Her father would know all of this already, would be living it in ways she could only imagine from this remote place. Around her, the other women bent over their own letters, faces concentrated in the dim lamplight. Maria wrote to her parents in Milan with careful optimism, describing the ranch as if it were a temporary inconvenience rather than an indefinite captivity. She did not mention that Milan was now under German occupation, that the Repubblica Sociale Italiana claimed authority her parents might or might not recognize. Some truths were too heavy to commit to paper. Francesca Benedetti wrote a single letter that both she and Elena would sign, addressed to their aunt in Padua, since they had no idea if their parents in Tripoli were even alive. The sisters had not heard from home since their capture in May. 5 months of silence that grew heavier with each passing week. Francesca's hand trembled slightly as she formed the words, trying to sound hopeful for Elena's sake. Young Lucia wrote to her mother with the desperate cheerfulness of someone trying to convince herself as much as her reader. She described the ranch, the endless sky, the strange beauty of the desert landscape. She did not write about the nightmares that still woke her, memories of the chaotic retreat across North Africa, the sound of bombs falling, the fear that had become so constant, she had almost stopped noticing it until captivity gave her the safety to remember. They sealed their letters and handed them to Captain Morrison, who promised they would be sent through proper channels. Everyone nodded and said, "Thank you." No one mentioned that months might pass before responses came, if responses came at all. The women of the compound were learning that waiting was its own kind of work, requiring its own kind of strength. Sarah Sullivan arrived at the ranch on a Saturday morning in mid-October, driving a dusty Ford pickup that announced her approach long before she came into view. She was Jake Sullivan's daughter, though Julia wouldn't learn this until later. At first glance, she appeared to be in her early 20s, with her father's height and the same steady, assessing gaze that seemed to run in the family. She came bearing books. 3 wooden crates filled with donated volumes from the Episcopal Church in the nearest town, some 40 miles away. Captain Morrison had mentioned the prisoners' need for reading material during a community meeting, and Sarah had taken it upon herself to organize a collection. She unloaded the crates with the easy strength of someone accustomed to physical work, declining help from the guards with a polite but firm independence that reminded Julia achingly of herself before the war had complicated everything. The women gathered around the crates like children at Christmas, pulling out books with careful reverence. Most were in English, which limited their immediate usefulness, but there were a few Italian volumes mixed in, probably donated by families with European heritage. Julia found herself holding a worn copy of Dante's Inferno, its pages soft with age and reading. She hadn't realized how desperately she had missed books until one was in her hands again. Sarah watched the women with open curiosity, her expression free of the suspicion or hostility the prisoners had learned to expect from townspeople on the rare occasions they encountered them. Instead, she seemed genuinely interested, her eyes moving from face to face as if trying to understand who these women were beyond their status as enemy prisoners. "You read Italian?" she asked Julia, nodding toward the Dante. Her voice carried the same unhurried cadence as her father's, that distinctive Texas drawl that Julia was beginning to understand. "Yes," Julia answered carefully. "Is my language. I speak English, small amount." Sarah smiled, and it transformed her face from merely pleasant to genuinely warm. "Your English is better than my Italian, which is exactly 0 words." She pulled a small notebook from her jacket pocket. "Maybe we could help each other? I've always wanted to learn another language, and you could practice your English. Fair trade?" The offer was so unexpected, so casually generous, that Julia found herself nodding before she fully considered the implications. Over the next hour, while the other women explored the books and Sarah chatted with Captain Morrison about future donations, Julia learned that Sarah taught at a one-room schoolhouse 20 miles west of the ranch, that she had grown up on this land, riding horses, before she could properly walk, that her mother had died when Sarah was 12, and she had kept house for her father ever since, managing both her teaching duties and the domestic side of ranch life with the same quiet competence Jake brought to his work. "You work with the animals," Sarah observed. "Dad mentioned you knew your way around livestock. That's rare, especially for someone from a city." "Not city," Julia corrected gently. "Farm. Small farm. But my father, he teach me." Thanksgiving came with little fanfare, another American holiday that meant nothing to the Italian prisoners, until Captain Morrison announced that the ranch hands and their families would be sharing the celebration meal with the compound. The decision sparked controversy among some of the military guards who felt it inappropriate to socialize with enemy nationals, but Morrison overrode their objections with the practical observation that the women had been model prisoners and that common decency cost nothing. The mess hall was transformed for the occasion. Martha Chen, who had taken charge of the meal preparation, recruited several of the Italian women to help, teaching them to prepare dishes they had never encountered. Turkey, cornbread dressing, sweet potatoes candied with molasses, green beans cooked with bacon, the kitchen filled with steam and unfamiliar aromas, while Martha moved between the women with patient instruction, her hands demonstrating when language failed. Julia found herself working alongside Sarah Sullivan, peeling potatoes in a rhythm that required no conversation. Sarah had arrived early to help, bringing pies her father had purchased from a neighbor, since neither Sullivan possessed their late wife and mother's talent for baking. The easy silence between them felt companionable rather than awkward, both women comfortable with work that didn't require constant words. When the meal was finally ready, long tables had been arranged in rows, and for the first time since their arrival, the prisoners sat down to eat with their captors as something approaching equals. Jake Sullivan said a brief grace that thanked God for the food, the land, and the peace that allowed them all to gather. Julia noticed he carefully avoided any mention of victory or defeat, war or enemies. His prayer acknowledged only the present moment and the shared sustenance before them. The food was strange to Italian palates, too sweet in some dishes, too savory in others, but it was abundant and prepared with care. Julia sat between Maria and young Lucia, across from Tommy Reeves and Miguel Santos. The conversation started tentatively, with long pauses and careful translations, but gradually found its rhythm. Tommy asked about Italian food, which prompted Maria to describe her grandmother's risotto with such passionate detail that everyone at the table laughed at her obvious homesickness for a proper meal. Miguel shared stories about his own grandmother's cooking, finding common ground in the universal language of family recipes and childhood memories. The Benedetti sisters taught old Henry Pierce how to pronounce basic Italian greetings, giggling at his earnest attempts that mangled every vowel. Even the military guards, initially stiff and formal, began to relax as the evening progressed and the shared meal worked its subtle magic. Jake Sullivan sat at the head of the main table, saying little as usual, but Julia noticed how his eyes moved around the room with quiet satisfaction. This had been his suggestion, she later learned from Sarah. He had convinced Captain Morrison that treating the prisoners with dignity would cause no harm and might accomplish what force and restriction never could, creating an atmosphere of cooperation rather than resentment. As the evening wound down and the women helped clean up, Julia realized something had shifted. They were still prisoners, still enemies technically, but the walls between them and their captors had developed cracks. That simple human kindness was slowly widening. December brought news from Italy that shattered whatever illusions the prisoners still maintained about returning to the country they remembered. Captain Morrison received regular intelligence briefings, and he had developed enough respect for the women under his supervision to share relevant information rather than leaving them to imagine the worst. The briefings painted a picture of chaos. Italy was now split between two governments, neither fully legitimate, both claiming authority over a population too exhausted to care much about political allegiances. The Germans occupied the north, propping up Mussolini's puppet republic. The Allies controlled the south, advancing slowly up the peninsula through brutal mountain warfare. In between, partisan groups fought both the Germans and each other, settling old scores while claiming patriotic motivations. Julia stood in the mess hall with the other women, listening as Captain Morrison read translated excerpts from intelligence reports. Her hands gripped the back of a chair so tightly her knuckles went white. Rome had been declared an open city to spare it from destruction, but the surrounding countryside was a battleground. Her family's farm sat directly in the path of the Allied advance northward. She had no way of knowing if they had fled, if they had survived, if the farm still stood. Maria received the worst news. Milan, her hometown, was under heavy German occupation. The factories where her father had worked were being used to produce war materials for the Reich. Partisan attacks and German reprisals had turned the city into a place of constant fear and violence. Maria's face went completely blank when Morrison finished reading, a protective shutdown that worried Julia more than tears would have. The Benedetti sisters learned that Tripoli, where their parents had been living, remained under Allied control but in administrative chaos. Thousands of displaced persons were flooding the city, and record-keeping had essentially collapsed. Their aunt in Padua had not responded to letters, probably because Padua was in the German-occupied north, where mail service had become unreliable at best. Even young Lucia, whose family was from a small village in Sicily now well behind Allied lines, discovered that liberation had brought its own complications. British and American soldiers were everywhere, requisitioning supplies, commandeering buildings, treating the local population with a mixture of charity and suspicion that left everyone uncertain about their status. That night, the atmosphere in the bunkhouse was heavy with grief and confusion. These women had joined their country's war effort, believing they understood what they were fighting for. They had been captured believing they would eventually return to resume their lives. Now they understood that the Italy they had known no longer existed. The country they would return to, if they returned at all, would be something entirely different, shaped by forces beyond their control or understanding. Julia lay awake listening to the muffled sounds of crying from various corners of the room. Outside, she could hear the normal sounds of the ranch, horses moving in the corral, the distant lowing of cattle, the steady rhythms of a world that continued regardless of human sorrows. For the first time since her capture, she wondered seriously whether returning home was even what she wanted anymore. January brought the winter roundup, when the scattered cattle had to be gathered, counted, and the calves branded before spring. Jake Sullivan approached Captain Morrison with an unusual request. Several of the ranch hands had taken sick with influenza, leaving them short-handed for the week-long operation. Would the captain permit some of the prisoners to assist? The work would keep them outdoors and well away from any sensitive areas, and their labor would be compensated with additional privileges. Morrison surprised everyone by agreeing, with the condition that guards would accompany the work party. He selected Julia and 5 other women who had shown aptitude for outdoor work. The prospect of leaving the compound, even temporarily, sent a ripple of excitement through the selected prisoners that they tried to hide behind appropriate solemnity. The roundup began before dawn on a Monday morning, cold enough to make breath visible. The women were provided with warmer clothes, sturdy boots, and gloves before being loaded into trucks that carried them to the far reaches of the ranch. Julia had thought she understood the scale of the operation, but seeing it firsthand was different. The ranch covered thousands of acres, stretching to horizons that seemed impossible in their vastness. Jake Sullivan divided the workers into teams, pairing each Italian woman with an experienced hand. Julia found herself assigned to ride with Tommy Reeves, which meant she would be on horseback. She hadn't ridden since leaving Italy, and the prospect both thrilled and terrified her. Tommy helped her mount a calm mare named Daisy, adjusting her stirrups with patient efficiency while explaining in simple English what they would be doing. The actual work was harder than anything Julia had experienced. They rode for hours, searching draws and canyons for cattle that had wandered far from the main herd. When they found animals, they had to drive them back toward the gathering point, which required constant attention and quick reactions. Tommy made it look effortless, his movements synchronized with his horse as if they shared a single mind. Julia struggled initially, but muscle memory from her youth gradually returned. What struck her most was watching the Cowboys work together. They communicated across vast distances with hand signals and whistles, coordinating their movements with precision that rivaled any military operation she had witnessed. But there was no shouting, no panic, no wasted motion. Just steady, relentless competence applied to a task that required equal parts skill, strength, and patience. By midday, they had gathered several dozen cattle and were driving them toward the main herd. Julia sat on Daisy, exhausted but exhilarated, watching Jake Sullivan work the outer edge of the moving cattle. He sat his horse with absolute confidence, his presence alone enough to guide stubborn steers back toward the group. There was something almost graceful in how he moved, despite his size, as if years of this work had worn away everything unnecessary until only essential capability remained. That evening, gathered around a campfire with the other workers, Julia realized she had never felt more alive. Her body ached, her face was sunburned despite the winter cold, but she had contributed something real to something that mattered. The roundup lasted 5 days, and each day revealed something new to Julia about the men she worked alongside. On the 3rd evening, exhausted and sore, she sat by the campfire watching Jake Sullivan repair a broken saddle strap by firelight. His hands moved with the same sure competence he brought to everything, fingers thick and calloused but surprisingly dexterous as he worked the leather and needle. She pulled out the small journal she had managed to keep throughout her captivity, a gift from Sarah Sullivan, who had noticed Julia's habit of writing on scraps of paper. In the flickering firelight, she began to write in Italian, trying to capture what she was witnessing. The words came slowly at first, then faster as understanding crystallized into language. "These cowboys are larger than soldiers," she wrote. "Not in physical size, though many are tall and broad, but in the way they occupy space in the world. Soldiers derive their authority from rank, from the institutions that stand behind them. Remove the uniform, and many become ordinary men, uncertain of their place. But these cowboys carry their authority inside themselves. It comes from competence, from the certain knowledge that they can handle whatever this harsh land demands of them." She paused, watching Tommy Reeves demonstrate rope tricks to young Lucia, who laughed at his exaggerated showmanship. Miguel Santos was teaching Maria a Mexican ballad. their voices blending in the cold night air. Even the military guards had relaxed their vigilance, drawn into the easy camaraderie that the shared work had created. Julia continued writing. I have known officers who commanded hundreds of men, who could order subordinates to their deaths with a signature. But I have never known men who possess such complete mastery over their own lives and circumstances. These cowboys need no permission to act, no orders to tell them what must be done. They see what the land requires, and they do it, day after day, without complaint or praise or any expectation beyond the work itself. She thought of the Italian officers she had served under, men who spent more time worrying about their status and image than about the tasks before them. She thought of the German officers she had encountered, rigid and formal, trapped inside roles they performed rather than inhabited. Even the American military men she had met carried a certain self-consciousness about their authority, an awareness that their power was borrowed from the institutions they represented. But Jake Sullivan needed no institution to validate him. When he gave instructions, men followed them not because of any rank or title, but because his judgment was trusted through proven reliability. When he made decisions, no one questioned them because everyone had seen him make good decisions under pressure countless times before. His authority was earned through daily demonstration, rather than granted through ceremony or appointment. The other women were noticing it too. That night in their tent, the Benedetti sisters talked quietly about Miguel Santos, how he had taught them to read animal tracks, to predict weather from the behavior of birds, to find water in seemingly barren landscape. He knows things, Francesca said with wonder, real things, useful things, not political theories or military doctrine, but knowledge you can actually use to survive. Maria, usually quiet and withdrawn since the news about Milan, spoke up unexpectedly. They're complete, she said. These men. They don't need anything outside themselves to feel worthy. The soldiers I knew, even the officers, they were always performing, always trying to prove something. These cowboys just are. After the roundup ended and the women returned to the compound, Julia's work with the livestock became more extensive. Jake Sullivan had been impressed enough with her capabilities to request she be assigned as a permanent assistant for animal care. Captain Morrison agreed, recognizing that the arrangement benefited everyone involved. This meant Julia spent several hours each day working directly with Jake, often in comfortable silence broken only by brief instructions or observations about the animals. It was during these quiet stretches that Jake began to share his philosophy, though he would never have called it that. To him, these were simply observations about the world, spoken in the same unhurried drawl he used for everything. They were treating a calf with scours one February morning when Jake said, seemingly to no one in particular, "Land tells you everything you need to know if you learn to listen." Most folks spend their whole lives talking when they should be paying attention. Julia looked up from where she was preparing the medicine. "In Italy, we have mountains," she offered carefully. "They also speak, I think, but different language than desert." Jake nodded slowly, considering this. "Reckon that's true. Every place has its own way of teaching. Desert's honest, though. Shows you real quick what you're made of. Can't pretend to be something you're not when there's nothing between you and the sun but 30 miles of empty land." Over the following weeks, these conversations became a kind of education Julia had never received in any classroom. Jake talked about patience, about understanding that some things couldn't be rushed, no matter how urgent they seemed. He explained how a good cowboy learned to work with an animal's nature rather than against it, how force usually created more problems than it solved. "Young fellas, they come out here sometimes thinking they'll conquer the land," he said one day while they were checking fence lines. "Break it to their will, like they're at war with it. Never works. Land's bigger than any man's will. Smarter approach is learning to read what the land's already trying to tell you, then working within those limits." Julia heard in his words an entire worldview that contradicted everything fascism had taught her. Mussolini's Italy had been built on the idea of will triumphant, of forcing reality to bend to ideological vision. Jake's philosophy accepted reality as it was and found strength in adaptation rather than domination. "You think different than soldiers," she ventured one afternoon. "They were in the barn. and she was helping him inventory medical supplies. "You think like farmer maybe, but also different." Jake smiled slightly, which for him was nearly effusive. "Cowboys aren't soldiers and aren't quite farmers either. Farmers try to control their land, make it produce what they want. Cowboys are more like shepherds maybe. We work with what's already here, try to keep things healthy and moving in the right direction, but we know we're not really in control. Nature is. Weather is. We're just trying to do our part without making things worse." The humility in his words struck Julia deeply. She had been raised in a culture that celebrated dominance and control, that measured worth in terms of power exercised over others. Jake measured worth in competence, in the ability to handle responsibility without needing recognition or praise. He did what needed doing because it needed doing, not for glory or advancement or even acknowledgement. "This is wisdom," Julia said quietly. "What you say, this is what my grandmother would call wisdom." Jake looked embarrassed by the compliment. "Just common sense learned from making enough mistakes. Land's a good teacher if you let it be." Spring of 1944 arrived with wildflowers, carpeting the previously brown landscape in unexpected bursts of color. With the changing season came official word from Washington about repatriation procedures for Italian prisoners. Italy was now technically a co-belligerent, no longer an enemy, but not quite an ally, which created complicated legal questions about the status of prisoners captured before the surrender. Captain Morrison called a meeting to explain the options. The women could choose immediate repatriation through displaced persons processing in Europe, or they could request to remain in the United States temporarily while awaiting final decisions about their status. The choice would be theirs, but it had to be made within 30 days. The announcement created turmoil in the compound. For months, the women had existed in a strange suspended state, neither quite prisoners nor quite free. Now they had to decide who they were and where they belonged. The discussions that followed were intense, emotional, and deeply personal. Maria Campana was the first to voice what several others were thinking. "What are we returning to?" she asked during a late-night conversation in the bunkhouse. "My family's letters say Milan is destroyed, there's no work, no food, Germans everywhere treating Italians like slaves. My father writes that he wishes he could come here instead of me going back there." The Benedetti sisters remained undecided. Francesca felt a powerful pull to return, to search for their parents even though all evidence suggested they had perished in North Africa. Elena wanted to stay, admitted quietly that she had never felt as safe and purposeful as she did working on the ranch. The conflict between them created a tension that affected everyone around them. Young Lucia surprised everyone by announcing firmly that she intended to stay if permitted. "There's nothing for me in Sicily except memories of who I was before," she said. "Here, I can become someone new, someone better than the girl who believed all those lies." Julia found herself paralyzed by the choice. Her loyalty to her family pulled her toward Italy. Her father would be aging, might need her help with the farm if it still existed. Her brother, if he had survived, would be dealing with the chaos of a country torn between competing governments and occupying armies. How could she abandon them to build a life in America? But another part of her, growing stronger each day, recognized that she had changed in fundamental ways. The beliefs she had carried from Italy had been dismantled piece by piece through her exposure to these quiet, competent Americans who contradicted everything she had been taught about them. She had discovered capabilities in herself that Italian society would never have allowed her to develop. As a veterinary nurse on this ranch, she contributed meaningfully in ways that would have been impossible as a woman in fascist Italy. She sought counsel from Sarah Sullivan, who had become something like a friend despite the strangeness of their circumstances. They sat on the corral fence one evening, watching the sunset paint the desert in shades of orange and purple. "What would you do?" Julia asked. "If you were me?" Sarah was quiet for a long moment. "I think," she said finally, "that home isn't always where you come from. Sometimes it's where you discover who you're meant to be. My mother used to say that courage isn't about doing what's expected, it's about doing what's right, even when everyone thinks you're wrong." "But my family," Julia protested. "My duty." "Your duty is to become the best version of yourself you can be," Sarah said gently. "Sometimes that means staying. Sometimes it means going. Only you can know which is right for you." The 30-day deadline approached with agonizing slowness. Julia spent hours writing letters to her father, trying to explain feelings she barely understood herself. She described the ranch, the work she did, the respect she had earned through her skills. She asked his blessing to remain in America temporarily, promising it wouldn't be forever, knowing even as she wrote the words that she might be lying to both of them. His response arrived 2 weeks before the deadline, carried through military channels and Red Cross networks, delayed and censored but ultimately intact. His handwriting was shakier than she remembered, his words fewer. The farm had survived but was damaged. Her brother had joined the partisans in the north and hadn't been heard from in months. Her father was managing alone, struggling, but alive. The final paragraph made Julia weep. "You ask my blessing to stay in America. Daughter, you have always had my blessing to become whoever you need to be. I raised you to think for yourself, even when that thinking led you to join a cause I never believed in. If America offers you a better life than this broken country can provide, then take it. Do not let an old man's loneliness steal your future. Make me proud by being happy, wherever that happiness leads you." With her father's words releasing her from obligation, Julia made her decision. She would request permission to remain in the United States as a displaced person seeking residency. The choice felt simultaneously like betrayal and liberation. Grief and hope intermingled so thoroughly, she couldn't separate them. She wasn't alone. Maria Campana made the same choice, as did young Lucia and 4 other women. The Benedetti sisters reached a compromise after weeks of painful discussion. Francesca would return to search for their parents and manage family affairs. Elena would stay in America, creating a foothold that Francesca could join later if she chose. It was an imperfect solution, but it honored both their needs. Captain Morrison processed their requests with efficiency and what seemed like genuine approval. He had grown fond of these women who had transformed from defeated enemies into valued workers. He wrote letters of recommendation for each one, emphasizing their skills, work ethic, and integration into the local community. Finding sponsors proved easier than expected. The Henderson family, whom Sarah had introduced to Julia months earlier, immediately offered to sponsor her, providing housing and assistance with employment. Dr. Hayes, who supervised the camp's medical operations, arranged for Maria to continue studying nursing at a program in San Antonio. Local ranching families, impressed by stories of the Italian women's contributions during the roundup, stepped forward to sponsor the others. Jake Sullivan played a quiet but crucial role, using his standing in the community to vouch for the women's character. His word carried weight in ways that official documents never could. When skeptics questioned whether former enemy nationals should be welcomed into their communities, Jake's simple statement that they were good workers who deserved a chance usually ended the debate. By mid-April, the arrangements were finalized. 7 women would return to Italy. 8, including Julia, would begin new lives as permanent residents of Texas, their imprisonment transformed into immigration through circumstances none of them could have predicted. The final days at the compound were bittersweet. The women who had chosen repatriation prepared for departure with mixed emotions, while those staying faced the uncertainty of truly beginning again. On the last evening before the groups would separate, Captain Morrison organized a farewell gathering that brought together everyone who had been part of this unexpected community. The mess hall was decorated simply but thoughtfully. Someone had strung wildflowers across the rafters, and Martha Chen had prepared a meal that combined American and Italian elements, a culinary representation of the cultural bridge they had all been building. The tables were arranged without regard to status or nationality, prisoners and guards and cowboys sitting together in the arrangements that had become natural over the months. Jake Sullivan stood to speak, which surprised everyone since he rarely addressed groups. His words were characteristically brief but carried weight that longer speeches might have lacked. 18 months ago, a group of women arrived here who we were told were our enemies. Turns out, enemies are just people you don't know yet. You've worked hard, contributed much, and taught us that seeing past differences isn't complicated. It just requires actually looking." Francesca Benedetti responded on behalf of those returning to Italy. Her voice trembled but remained steady. "We came as fascists, believers in a cause we thought was righteous. We leave as something different. Humbled, perhaps. Certainly changed. You showed us that strength doesn't require cruelty, that power can be gentle, that discipline doesn't need brutality to be effective. We carry these lessons home with us." Giulia spoke for those staying, switching between Italian and English so everyone could understand portions of her words. Contadina means peasant farmer in Italian, but also means someone who works the land with their hands and heart. Cowboys, I think, are America's contadinas. You understand what my people have always known, that real wealth is measured in soil and animals and sunsets, not in politics or power. You accepted us not because of what we believed, but because of what we could do, what we were willing to learn. This is the America we choose to make our home. The evening continued with music. Miguel Santos brought out a guitar and played Mexican corridos that told stories of hard work and homeland. Maria sang an Italian folk song her grandmother had taught her, her voice clear and pure in the wooden hall. Tommy Reeves taught everyone a ridiculous cowboy ballad that had them all laughing at its absurd lyrics. As the night wound down, Giulia found herself standing outside with Jake, both watching the stars that seemed impossibly bright in the desert darkness. "You'll do well here," he said simply. "You've got the temperament for this life. Patient, observant, willing to work with what is rather than complaining about what isn't." "I learned from good teacher," Giulia said, her English now fluent enough for subtle meanings. Jake smiled slightly. "Reckon we learned from each other. That's how it's supposed to work." The next morning, 7 women boarded trucks bound for processing centers and eventual passage to Italy. 8 remained behind, no longer prisoners, beginning the complicated process of building American lives on the foundation of their Italian pasts. 22 years later, in the spring of 1966, Giulia Sullivan stood in the same corral where she had first treated an injured mare, watching her teenage son work with a young colt. The boy had his grandfather's patience and his father's quiet competence, though he had never met the Italian grandfather who had blessed his mother's choice to stay in America. She had married Jake Sullivan in 1947, after 3 years of working alongside him had deepened respect into love. Their courtship had been as unhurried as everything else about him, a gradual recognition that they understood each other in ways that required few words. Sarah had been her maid of honor, standing beside her as Giulia became officially what she had already become in practice: a Texan, an American, a woman defined by her choices rather than her origins. The ranch had prospered under their joint management. Giulia's veterinary skills combined with Jake's ranching knowledge created an operation known throughout the region for the health of its livestock. They had raised 3 children who knew their mother's history but understood it as background rather than defining characteristic. She was simply Mom, who could deliver a calf as easily as she could cook Sunday dinner, who spoke Italian when she was angry and English when she was content. Maria Campana had become Dr. Maria Chen, having married Martha's nephew and completed her medical degree. She ran a clinic in San Antonio that served immigrant communities, her own experience as a displaced person informing her compassionate practice. Young Lucia had married a local rancher and raised 5 children, becoming a pillar of her community and serving on the school board. The other women who had stayed had similarly woven themselves into the fabric of Texas life, their Italian origins becoming interesting footnotes rather than defining limitations.